uh, and deep and sophisticated and insightful and nuanced quotes from better thinkers than myself. This is really me coming to you and saying, can we have a community conversation about this? Because I don't think we talk about it enough. I don't think we talk about ethics enough in terms of not in terms of the individual and the particular and the localized. I think as people engaged in futures practice, it's very much embedded in futures practice, in future studies, in futures research, and to some extent in foresight, um, to take not only a creative approach to our exploring futures, but a systemic approach and a critical approach. And I think the more we think systemically and critically, the more we get into that space of asking not just what are the impacts of change, but what are the both the intended and unintended consequences of change, both change that other people make or other parts of the system make, but changes that we ourselves make as part of adapting to the sea of change that is our context. So there's that question of accountability and responsibility for those intended and unintended consequences. And there is also that critical set of questions about and how do the consequences and the impacts of changes, the changes we make and the changes to which we're adapting, how do those impacts cascade out and whom do they affect and how? And I think the critical issues especially are important when we are talking about um, the disempowerment and marginalization of different communities of life on the planet, not just humans, but other communities of life as well. And also internally, how we are disempowering ourselves perhaps by not being mindful of different patterns of thought within our own heads. So it's an issue that so I have two stories to share that illustrate why I've been thinking about this. One is from fairly recently, from my own practice within my own team. But one is actually, actually one that goes all the way back. I mean, wow, really, this is the dark ages. Many of you were not alive. All the way back to my dissertation defense. So there I am sitting in a room with, let's see, Ken Lowry was an urban planner, urban and community planner, Jim Dater, of course, Doug Bai, political scientist and quantitative researcher, Michael Hamnett, who is an anthropologist and Pacific Islands policy expert. I'm forgetting somebody. You'd think my committee would be just drilled into my brain. In any case, and so I'm defending this dissertation, which my dissertation was one of the least academic dissertations ever written. It was essentially a methods textbook wrapped around the concept of future studies and futures research as contributing directly to leadership as leadership is as defined as transformational change creation. So visionary leadership specifically. So that was the connection I made to political science. My, my brief my brief flirtation with political science, even though they were the department that was actually granting my PhD, and all the rest of it was future studies. So it was very much a how-to book drawn from various actual projects that we had done within Hawaii, with some at the state government level with different corporations out in the Pacific Island nations. And so it was sort of a soup to nuts if you want to do a complete foresight project from sort of horizon scanning through impact assessment to scenarios to visioning to change creation, action creation strategy. What would that look like, and what are some of the tools? Okay, great. So I'm explaining all of this, and I'm working through the examples and connecting it to literature as best I can. And it was for the most part a very kind and gentle defense, for which I am grateful forever. But the tough question at the end, came from, yes, Glenn Page, the political leadership expert. The planner went, wow, this is useful. We need this as a handbook, which was the thing that I took away from me and thought, thank you, I feel better about that. But Glenn Page, who is famous for actually peace activism, but um, started his political science career looking at leadership. He went, okay, this would be useful for political leaders. I can see community leaders using some of these techniques and approaches, and that makes sense, as you've demonstrated with some of these examples. But so you're telling people how to be compelling leaders, essentially, because you're connecting here's a tool to help a group of people articulate a vision in one of your chapters. And I said, uh-huh. And he said, and that's connected, as we know, to true transformational and visionary leaders. One of the things they do is they sort of diagnose a problem and they offer to their constituents a positive view of the future that is compelling, that attracts followers to them. Followers who think that they're all working with the leader on a vision that they all share. And I said, yeah, exactly. Good. I wrote it clearly. And he went, yeah. What would you do if Hitler had gotten a hold of this? Okay, so first of all, not a question I was expecting. Um, but it was an interesting ethical issue. To some extent, that is exactly what Hitler did. He diagnosed a problem that some of the people in his country were having with conditions as they currently were, and he offered them a compelling vision of to him and to them, preferred future that attracted a lot of followers and that made them feel okay about a lot of what they did under his regime. And we're sort of seeing the same thing now, and I don't want to go into American politics, but this issue of, whose vision of the future going to win out is going to win out in the long run. And Pollock would tell us that hopeful images of the future keep societies alive, and dark and depressing images of the future are a great way to kill societies. So I know which side I'm rooting for in the American presidential election. But that issue of, if our tools are really effective, who do we decide to use them for? Who do we decide to offer them to? Or do we not actually think that they're that effective at shifting mindset, at being persuasive, at being transformational? Okay, so that's story number one. That's my first anecdote. And I am still mulling that over. And I at one point was talking to a senior practitioner she was actually a community leadership and community sort of change agent, a community activist, but she did a lot of training in that space. And I sort of said, how do you say yes to everybody that comes and asks for your assistance? And she says, no, no, I don't. I say no to people that I think are actively sort of doing the world or their team or their organization or their community harm. Okay, now obviously there's a tension there between the fact that many of us are freelancers. And so you have to make choices between continuing to pay your rent and your bills, feed your family, and the ethics of saying no. So to me, that's one very practical area of tension that we all had. And it has come up in various conversations. I remember, I think at last year's Dubai Futures Forum, Alex Fernandi said, we can inveigh against capitalism all that we like, and yet very many of us in this room are earning our livelihoods engaging with the capitalist system. And that's absolutely true. So, every time you go in and work with a corporation, are you going to say, seriously, the capitalist world system in which you are determined to make more money for your stockholders should not exist? Not a great sales pitch in management terms. Okay, so let me flash forward to the second story. And then I think since a few more people, oh, we are actually up to 28. So since I think everyone is here, then let's go through a little round of introductions, or at least having people sign in on the Miro board. I see a lot of people have. Um, and then let's talk about um, how we can sort of harvest some similar examples from everybody else in the room effectively and maybe start organizing them. Okay, so second example. Um, I was contacted by someone that was sort of in my wider network of, folks that work in the futures field who's recently moved from a futures consultancy to being an in-house futurist at a large organization that um, I don't necessarily want to point fingers at exactly, but let's just say that they purvey to the global public uh, one of the items to which we are all uh, addicted in socially acceptable ways. Wow, that's a bit roundabout. Um, I'll be more specific, a tobacco industry group. Now, my father actually died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from years of smoking. So I have been materially harmed by the tobacco industry. And this colleague was sort of saying, so I'm coming talking to you not from the sales department, not from the marketing department, but kind of from the R&D department, and we are interested in sort of what's beyond tobacco. Interesting. So, practical application of ethics and practical question of how do I know where I'm going to draw boundaries? So one of the things that it clarified in my mind was if someone in an industry that I think is harmful comes to me and says, we want to have conversations about how we can move into a less harmful space. I'm kind of inclined to think I should support any movement towards less harm that they might want to make. So that kind of made the decision for me. But now I'm working with a team of people. So then there's the other ethical question of I'm co-founder of a company. And in theory, I could just order my team to do work with this client if I choose to do work with this client. So it's not only the ethics of what the client does and the client's impact on the outside world, but the sort of me to the client's team of how am I intersecting with them and what are we doing together? But it's also me and my team. How am I interacting with them on this issue? And coming out of this, our team actually had a conversation about how do we handle problems like this? How do we handle ethical issues like this? Understanding that different people on our team come from different cultures, different experiences, have um, have values that are weighted along different trade-offs. So what do we do about that? So basically, we had to come up with kind of an ethical rule of thumb of, first of all, we all sit down and have a serious conversation about this a potential opportunity with a client who may be ethically dodgy in terms of their impact on the world, because we have as part of our mission doing better by people and planet. Okay. And if the client then falls at least partially on the side of the angels, or if the project falls at least partially on the side of the angels, excuse me, I will periodically be coughing or sneezing because I'm getting over the flu, which is why I'm pausing periodically to swallow and things. But anyway, so the other thing we realized is that we had to create a mechanism that let anyone on our team express their discomfort and give them the option of opting out. So it wasn't just a question of my personal practice and my personal ethical perspective, my ethical judgment on what the potential client was doing in the world, but also the ethics of within the team giving people the freedom to make their own ethical judgments and to live by those. So, what I'm curious about is what kind of struggles other people have faced. And if we can collect some of these stories and begin to see if in continued conversation, I don't think we're going to, get this in one conversation, if there's a set of sort of, I'm not even going to call them guidelines, but kind of rules of thumb of ethics in futures practice. And I haven't even begun to address some of the actual ethics about or potential ethical dimensions of um, the futures that we discuss or promote themselves, which is, another area that we should probably get into. So let me just pause for a minute there and say to folks, I think we've got a whole lot of people who are signed in on the Miro board. And let me just share screen for a second. Yes. All right. Share. Okay, so in theory, everyone should be able to see the sign-in space. This is where we are. If you're having difficulty accessing the Miro board, do let us know in the chat, and we'll see if we can help you out. But there is no password or anything. It's just a plain click on this link, and you should be able to get in. So let me open it to suggestions. What, as I said, I was basically thinking maybe we could share a few stories. And first of all, um, the sorting brain, the I'm a facilitator, we cluster ideas brain kind of went, well, how could we sort things? So I hauled out a template for kind of integral futures, integral analysis, which, as you may recall, kind of divides things up into collecting data or stories or anecdotes, cases about what we observe externally, right? So what we observe of single individuals' actions, my own actions, how I acted, what I did, the collective of what groups of us do, how institutions act, companies act, and then um, the internal side, the intentional side of what I personally value, my own personal ethics, how they may be tested, what some rules of thumb that I myself use internally, and culture, what our culture is, either the local culture in which we are each differently embedded, or our organizational and team culture, um, or what we might call the general culture of futures. The trick with that, of course, is that futures has so many sub-tribes and communities in it that each of them may have different sort of approaches to what they value, and ethics. All right, so let me stop there because we're about half an hour in. And as I said, roughly, I'd like to collect some stories, and happy to just hear people talk. We can capture some of those. You can sort of say, yeah, this is a story about something that I struggled with kind of internally in my own value setting. And maybe we'll put some notes on that over in the upper left-hand corner. Or here's some stuff I've observed about, what I did in the moment or what other groups of people, here's what I've seen. We can put what we've observed other people doing in terms of making some of these decisions down in the lower right-hand corner. So let me just stop and say, um, open the floor to comments, reactions, suggestions. Where do you want to go from here? Tiana.
Maybe just I can share a story, just a recent one. Hi, everybody. I work at the World Organization for Animal Health, the Foresight lead there. And I've worked with Wendy and her crew actually on a big project for the 100th anniversary. So some things that I've come across, one in particular, I'll give an example in particular. In the animal health world, we have these global strategies. Sometimes they involve the eradication of certain diseases. And one particular instance came up where there was this sort of sense we need to push through this particular strategy about the eradication of foot and mouth disease in Asia. And the people who wanted to do this, they said, hey, we heard of this backcasting method. We would like to use that. And it made me pause for a minute. It made me think, is that what everybody wants? Does everybody want to eradicate FMD? If you know anything about FMD, it's a production limiting disease. There's humans, the animals actually, some of them recover. Of course, you don't want the animals to suffer. But the question was, oh gosh, okay. So I went back to the person and I said, with this backcasting method, maybe you might want to add in something about values and ask some questions around values, societal values, because you're a room full of veterinarians, and you don't necessarily, not everybody there will have a sense of societal values, what's happening. Your mission as veterinarians is to do X, the prevention of disease, the control of disease, this type of thing, medical interventions. But have you taken into account, or should you take into account, what might be happening outside of this global strategy, in terms of, might be animal rights activism, it might be, people who are actually absolutely, anti-vaxxers and animals, it could go in any different, multiple ways. So as you're doing this backcasting thing, maybe take into account, the societal factors here. So I don't know how it went, but I really did put a point on the fact that you're trying to push through a particular worldview, and a particular objective here that not everybody will be necessarily in agreement with. And so I was trying to just in case things go off the rails, this might be why.
Okay, great. So I tried to capture that, and I put it down in under, that seemed to me as sort of what we value, what people value questions. That's sort of an internal cultural thing, but the rule of thumb seems to be, have you had that conversation about values with everyone that you should be connecting with? Elaine.
Hi. It's more less of an anecdote, not an anecdote at all, actually, more around perhaps intentional values and culture. But I think there's something really valuable that's to do with just transition, or what is now shaping the corporate world in particular, and all the organizations and supply chains and communities. But in terms of the Lancet report that came out last week around Earth system boundaries, and there's a really particular point in it, which is we can transition to stay within planetary boundaries. Of course, we can do that, but there's one way of doing that, which is we continue with the status quo where very few people content and well, and then there's the just transition where and what does that look like? And I think there's something around, we've got all of these reporting frameworks, the EU corporate sustainability reporting directive. So we've got laws happening and we've got frameworks and we've got reporting frameworks, but what we haven't got is enough people or as futurists being in those spaces where we're really helping corporates to understand what that looks like, and not just big corporates, but right down to the pipeline of startups and things like that. So I think there's something intentional about us as a Foresight community of futurists to be able to go, what's our own understanding of what just transition looks like and the ethical dilemmas within that.
Okay. I like that. So kind of physician heal thyself first. Understand, make sure that we're clear on what we mean by that before we try and help other people become clear on that. Excellent. Doris.
Thank you very much. I so appreciate that comment on the just transition in South Africa. I'm from South Africa. There's a lot of conversations, and then just for whom. But I'm still in the middle, and I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, because we've been approached by a delegation of a defense force of a country that, I mean, their defense force, if you read up, they do terrible things. And so I was uncomfortable with them just coming into our premises in the first place, but they had the blessing of all other powers that be, and the powers said, no, you speak to those people, hear what it is that they want. They want to know about futures thinking, just like Amos said in there, what is this thing and how can it help you? And maybe they will come back with requests for training in futures thinking, and then maybe foresight projects about this defense force and things. So there they left. And then I didn't sleep for nights after that to say, what if they do come back? I'm really uncomfortable with wanting to think with them. And then in a conversation with one of the people that I regard as a mentor said, well, okay, you must also consider that you could actually influence them, because you may have them think about things that they otherwise, because that's what we do as foresight practitioners. We help people to see things that they don't see for themselves, or think about things that you don't. So I'm still in the dilemma. I appreciate this conversation.
Thank you for that. And I think, there is, interestingly, a lot of the defense industry, a lot of the military is interested often in futures thinking. And that is, while I don't think everyone that works for the military is evil, militaries are problematic, especially in the context of a just transition, and the fact that the road to a just transition will be rocky and conflictual, and that starts raising interesting intersections. Okay, so let's see, Esme and then Janine.
Hi, I guess I was quite interested in the story about sort of studying the team for making ethical choices. I've just come out of a piece of work that involved a whole load of marginalised people who had been fairly traumatised by a process, and the opportunity to do the work was the organisation that was the source of the trauma, or part of it, recent trauma, wanting to do something about a different future because of that. And the kind of ethical choices that I made in leading people into engaging with it, in the view that there were individuals who were doing the right thing, and then at a later point within the work, it was hijacked by the politicians who were not interested in doing the right thing. And we made a choice to stop the work. And all of those things around how we chose to end the work, were they the most effective ways to have influence within the system? So, you know, it's messy. I have no answers, but it kind of feels really real, all of that stuff. So I guess I'm really interested in those things. Yeah.
Maybe I should have called this the convening the group to discuss ethical traumas. Because it's tough and it's painful, and it's especially painful if you do have to. I mean, you made an ethical but difficult choice of saying we will stop rather than let you hijack this. That's a very difficult thing to do. So my heart goes to you, Janine, and then Muncie.
Yes, thank you very much. And I almost want to say that I'm not even sure that there is an answer here, because there's a danger of imposing personal ethics on a situation. And I am very conscious of how different societies might have different ethical considerations towards the same issue. I mean, I can just think of several of the examples that you talked about the world beyond tobacco, because your mission is to do good by people and planet. But what about the ethical consideration, perhaps, of a tobacco plant within a community who will lose their entire livelihood? I also think back to one of our professors mentioning an example you also referred to, if Hitler used your visionary leadership skills, of the leader of one of the concentration camps who believed that he was a very ethical family man, and was to the point where he would deduct his petrol usage of taking his family to church from his company Nazi expense sheet, and believed he was doing the right thing based on his ethical values. So and if I listen to the previous speaker about the politicians having a different political agenda, I wonder if there is a clear-cut answer to this question about what is ethical. Will it not always be subjective? Because ethics is such a personal choice. And I'm wondering whether it's not always going to come down to what am I prepared to be involved in, or put my name, and can I, like Doris mentioned, can I sleep tonight knowing that I'm involved with something, and does it work with my personal ethics and value system? It's something I come across a lot. I also lecture to potential chartered accountant students on Foresight, and they are dealing with this issue in future, where they know that they might be asked to do something in the corporate world that might contravene their personal ethics. We've had all these accounting disasters around the world, and also in South Africa recently. And what do you do when you have to pay your rent, and when you have your children's school fees to pay, but you are asked to do something that you know to be wrong or unethical? And almost to have that luxury of saying, like the previous speaker said, we could stop the work and walk away.
Thank you for those examples, and for linking that to struggles that people are having in other professions. And I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I agree entirely that ethics are cultural, specific, are subjective, are personal. That was my point, or that was the point I was trying to make about realizing that every person in the team had to make their own decisions about that. And in fact, your point about tobacco being viewed differently from the perspective of villagers or communities who are making their living raising tobacco was a point that was raised in the conversations with the client. So that became part of the struggles that the client was actually having, and in terms of their desire to move away from tobacco because of the health considerations, while at the same time realizing that they were supporting a large multinational. They were essentially economically partnering with rural communities all over the world who would be harmed if they suddenly went, oh, well, we're not just going to not sell tobacco anymore. So exactly, those are exactly the questions that were being raised throughout this project, and a different set of questions between me and the client side team, or those of us that chose to work with the client and the client side team, versus the kinds of a different set of subjective values that came into play when members of our team decided they were or were not going to work with. So I agree entirely. That's the tough part, is that this is, at some level, it's very, the ethical issues are very granular and contextual, and grounded in the context, and subjective and personal. So it's what makes it very difficult. You're right, to have rules of thumb. Anyway, sorry, Mansi. Great points. Thank you.
So yeah, my point was actually going back to your first, your example on tobacco, Wendy, actually, which was that, a lot of times you would like to believe that when somebody comes to you and says, hey, look, we want to change this thing, we want to do less harm, we want to change our business models, obviously that's exciting, because you do want to help them get past the things that they're doing that are not good, at a social level. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of these exercises are also done in bad faith from the side of the company, where they take this information and then they basically try to quash every potential challenge that might lead them to those futures, just in the effort to continue their current business. So I wonder if there's a way to think about that, or to take that into consideration.
That's wow. I want to see your exercises done in bad faith by company, and raise you exercises done in bad faith by policymakers and politicians. And the number of times political entities have gone, let's do a fun visioning exercise, or scenario building exercise, get the whole community involved, and then no matter what comes out of it, we're going to use it to basically legitimize a decision that we've already made. So often. So great point. Thank you for raising that, Mishka, and then Stephen. But before Mishka, thank everybody for continuing to add things into the categories. Yay, team. And you might want to take a little time to, since we just talked about ethics being so personal and subjective, think about what you value, and fill out the green space a little. Anyway, sorry, Mishka.
Hi, everybody. So I have a few examples or things that have happened to me. One of them is I have a good friend of mine. He's an artist, an animator, and we are from Argentina, right? And Monsanto is big here, like the north of the country. A lot of people are working on their plantations. And he was approached by the company in a moment. He was really starving, like he just had a baby and had almost no money. And the company asked him to make an animation about how green they were and how amazing for the community and the space they were in, right? So he debated a lot about what to do, because his personal beliefs were against that, right? But in the end, he needed the money, and we live in a system where we don't have the choice, right? In Latin America, we have had also, so he ended up doing the animation, right? Also, in Latin America, we don't have like a lot of love for public forces, right? Police and all that. So because we have had a rough history with them, to say the least. But for people in the in far provinces, in poor provinces, oftentimes the only way to get a salary, to get sustained job, to get food on their plates, is to get into the police, right? So we often do, like in the slang or when talking with friends, we often use two different words to talk about this. We talk about police, and that's like people that go into the force, and not always because they believe in the police. And then we use shuta for people that go into the force, but to sustain the system, and really like they are more like fascist, right? Fascists trying to enjoy and do what they can, right? And they will go against the I don't know, retired, right? Right now in Argentina, if you have seen any news about my country, the big problem we have is retired people. They are an issue, so police are going against them. Of course, I'm being sarcastic, right? So the other thing is, I work in the video game industry, right? And right now, during the pandemic, we had a big boom of crypto, right? Everything had to be crypto, everything had to be, right? And then ethically, you had to, me as a producer and a game designer and doing consulting, I was often faced with the decision of saying, okay, this is just gambling hide, right? Gambling reskinned as something else. And also, this is really doing badly for the environment, right? This is having an impact on the environment because this game needs such an amount of energy to work. So even if it's giving people job, works, a salary, food to eat, in a moment where it was really difficult, right? During the pandemic, should we do it? Really, we have to ask that about us, right? And now the industry is moving into AI, right? Let's use AI to replace artists, to replace, to facilitate a lot of what we do in the early stages of a project, right? And there is several ethical issues there to discuss, like who made the art, how do you train your AI, are you stealing, etc., 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 right? And then, but what happened in a recent job I had is they asked me, oh, we wanna implement AI for our artists. We want them to be able to create easier sketches and quickly with AI, which is fair enough usage. So they would work right at them after. And then we started talking about, okay, so which type of AI, right? Who's gonna train it? You need to develop it. If you are using your own model, you need to develop your model. You need to train it. The algorithms are very energy exhausting. So what's the impact on your company, on your budgeting, on the environment, right? There is a lot of things that you have to evaluate for this magical solution that is AI right now, right? And they hadn't even considered it, because it was just like, oh, let's bring in an AI and that's done. And it's like, no, okay, but bringing an AI into your project often has a lot of consequences. So one of the things that I'll oftentimes find in thinking about new projects, new technology, the usage of new ideas and thinking for the future, is that people don't evaluate the costs of it in general terms, right? The environmental cost, the racial cost, all AIs are biased right now, right? They are misogynistic, racist, and that's just a general rule of thumb, right? There is no one, unless you train it yourself. So, but training it is like, it's a lot of work, and so they have pre-imposed ethics and pre-imposed morals that you should tackle somehow. So if you're bringing in the technology, how are you working with that, right? How are you retraining it, or I don't know, filtering it? Anyways, those are some of the questions that I have, and a few examples of my vision. I hope
That's
something.
thank you so much for contributing those. And that really, wow, very specific examples that get to the issue I was trying to raise about intended and unintended consequences widely through the system of making what we sometimes think are simple choices, right? And as someone who did, in a moment of curiosity more than anything else, sort of feed a bunch of details into ChatGPT and say, write a scenario about this, just to see what happened. You know, and worked with an artist who did kind of the same thing due to time pressure. So so it's easy to see why we get drawn into or co-opted by, as what did you call it, the sort of some of the magical capacities of this, and don't really think, and most people don't think enough about the fact that AI uses enough energy that it's basically eating the planet, and also the social issues of sexism, racism, and everything else that you point out. So great, yeah, great points. Could people try and be careful that when they add post-its that they aren't covering other people's post-its? Thank you. Stephen, I think you're next. And
Hi, Wendy. In my context, to me, there's ethical issues just related to, are you potentially re-traumatizing people if you are asking them to engage with certain foresight sort of activities? My experience so far is I've been working with those that have gone through trauma healing, community-led initiatives and so forth, healing centered. And so their response when I inquire about this is, yes, please give this to us, because no one else has, and we want to gain and leverage our agency to think about the future. But my fear is being in some sort of population where asking them to do that, and they haven't necessarily reconciled things in the past, the you know, because the past and present and future are all kind of connected in our brains. Their engagement with the future is just drudging through the past, and not a great experience. Whereas I think most of us in this sort of space, we're all excited about thinking about the future and so forth. So it's kind of like, my fear is the ethical issues of like traumatizing somebody inadvertently. But when you're asking somebody to wrestle with something that they themselves don't even, like, this isn't something that you can do an IRB on and say, hey, you know, here are the potential, you know, side effects, because we really don't know what some of them are for some people. So to me, this is adding another component to it.
And that's a great point. I mean, because you don't want to re-scar people, even though, you know, lancing the traumas of the past may be temporarily painful. In theory, that's supposed to be, you know, healing.
But then sorry, Wendy, just the flip side of that is sometimes you do have to rip something off. You know, people are willing to go into that crazy sort of space to wrestle with something. And so, but somehow you have to have the consent of the group to say, do we want to go into some tough spaces where emotionally you're going into potentially charged sort of space, where facilitating that that's a whole nother animal that I don't think some of us are ready to.
Yes, that's an incredible, that's a whole skill set that you're right, that I'm not sure we all have. But yes, exactly. Well, that's why I'm saying lancing the pain of the past can be helpful if done right, but do we have the skills to do it right? And I want to underline something else that you said, which is, and yet if we don't address the trauma of the past, and you try to engage people in visioning, or any kind of transformational thinking, the pain and the negativity will resurface in the visioning and derail the visioning conversation. I have seen that happen over and over and over again. If you don't go through some form of catharsis phase first, the pain can derail, or the doubts, or the strong memories of past failure tend to derail people's ability to even be optimistic. Lena, it is Lena, yes, Lena.
Hey, Dr. Wendy, thanks for having this. And I was gonna say, kind of to Stephen's point, I think Kyran, she said having the right resources to plan for that trauma is the most important thing. And like if you're gonna rip the Band-Aid off, deal with trauma, definitely I agree with that. Have the right resources there, or a community member who can act as a stakeholder to help facilitate that conversation. But my points were, when we talked about like communities or cultures, I always think when we talk about that, we talk about it like in a macro scale, right? But what about the microcosms of cultures with inside those communities, that their perspectives can kind of get lost because they're not in the room, or people don't understand their perspectives, or don't even know that those perspectives exist. So I guess just commentary is more what I have of. And then like we talked about what happens if there is a project that conflicts with our personal ethics. I always think, well, what happens if I'm not in the room? What future will they create if I'm not there and my perspective isn't even understood? Even if it's dismissed, even if it's not used in the futuring process, being in that room, I still understand the other, and I hate to make it a duality, but I understand the other side's point of view, which could actually strengthen or help whatever community they're against protect themselves. So let's say for Dr. Wendy's example of the tobacco industry, if I did go into that room, and even if they dismiss my ideas, I now know what their futuring ideas are, so I could go back and provide safety for my family or my community. So I know the term insider threat is often used, but taking the negative point of view away from that word and just saying, if I'm an insider in this room, I can help provide safety to the community that's affected. And I understand the community that also carries the different ethics that are different from mine. So just, I guess, just commentary. But
Great,
thanks for
no,
having
great
us,
point.
Dr. Wendy.
Yeah, I love it. Great point. I mean, how do we, by being in the room, we connect as bridges, and that can be, for better or for worse. But one thing that futures does teach us is that the more diverse perspectives that we can get talking together and imagining together and thinking together, the better off I think we should be in the end. Amos.
Very important conversation here. I think it's how do we kind of trust in the process? So as futurists, we walk into a room and we're often working with people from completely different disciplines, and we're often picking up suddenly an issue that is just kind of like handed over to us, and we have to work very fast. And at what point are we doing this kind of extractive process, which is okay because we need to collect data. We need the future stuff. We need the future's knowledge, as they call it in Finland. Knowledge about the future in which we can kind of process and make some kind of viable product. Or then on the other side is when do we step back? And I had a situation in which I had to facilitate a workshop for women parliamentarians from PMU region, and this was the first time they had been together, and basically I was occupying their space, and I didn't want to take over their space, and so I had to make the kind of foresight process just basically follow what they were hoping to do anyway. And so my question is also like, when do we kind of step back and kind of facilitate from afar? And when is it okay to be like maybe extractive?
That's a great question. And especially for, for all of us who run facilitative processes, and almost everybody in this room, I'm sure does. There are very few people that entirely do futures as desk research. So great question, and it was reminding me of another example where I was working with a group of people that had been brought together by a health foundation, US-based health foundation, that wanted to think new thoughts about the future of health and well-being. And they had assembled an amazing group of community activists and they really focused on getting folks in from marginalized communities. And so we, the futures team, came in with our, set of methods, and we had a whole 2-day interactive workshop, planned out, and started with the Pollock game just as a warm up. Everyone kind of took to that really well, and then started explaining what else we were doing. And a representative from what you may variously call either Native Americans or First Nations stood up and went, I don't want to engage in this. This is being, why are we choosing this method? This method is a, sort of white, Western, middle class. This method itself is colonizing us. Interesting situation to be in, because I didn't really have a response to that. It's like, yes, you're right. It is. We are. Granted, the team lead was actually Hawaiian Chinese, so I left him to make the argument about that. And then actually one of the leaders from an African American community group stepped and went, we're invited here as guests and contributors, and these people, our hosts, have set up this whole process. So why don't we just roll with it and see where it takes us? So it was interesting. We had, and I respect all of those positions. And so what we tried to do was take on suggestions and flex as much as possible to establish comfort. But it's tough. It's not easy, especially when a little part of you is thinking, I can't completely tear this process apart because we literally don't have the time. Which gets us back to the constraint of being entrained by the global capitalist system that sort of says, you want to do good and worthy work, but oh, by the way, you're on the clock and you won't get paid. So I mean, it is interesting how in many ways shackled we are by not having yet made it to that just transition, right? Elaine, I hope I haven't missed anyone in the yeah, Elaine.
And hopefully this resonates with what you were just saying, but I think there's also, having run projects in marginalized communities with vulnerable groups for large IGOs. But I think we're also in a space where there's a danger when we're working with a community of using the process and it raises hope, but there's nothing that comes after because the corporate or the organization hasn't thought through, or, there's a promise in those activities where the corporate or the organization extracts and with the promise of building some programs, but they never emerge. And when you're, in deep poverty or in particularly as women and youth in most countries around the world, or all countries around the world, to have the promise of that participation is going to lead somewhere, it's something we need to think through, and maybe we need to consider what the full process is, and what, especially now as people are doing more ESG, the social strategy, the stakeholder engagement, the focus on stakeholder engagement with local communities, with vulnerable groups. What do we see in there? Where do we present the risks as we design those interactions? I'm very conscious of that, and I've seen many UN programs promise things that then leave particularly entrepreneurs hanging with nowhere to go because they didn't win the competition and things like that. So it's I haven't found a resolution, but I just would welcome any thoughts in an ongoing discussion.
Does anyone have hopeful counterexamples where there was follow through? We shouldn't. We're dredging up some of our own pain. That's useful. It would be, we should also periodically go, here's something that worked. So I'd be curious to know, are there any examples where there has been that you, the assembled group of, we've still got about 20 folks, can think of where, there was great follow through. And we did support the community. We had the sort of change activation futures activity. And then we did follow through to support folks. Any thoughts, examples? I should look in the chat. I'll let everyone mull that one over. I will say that at a point in time where everyone that I went to school with is writing their, here is the summation of all the fantastic things I've done in my career and all the lessons I've learned, books, and retiring, I am starting a new company at a somewhat advanced age. But the reason I'm doing that is because after 40 or more years of doing futures and doing the workshops and the scanning reports and the scenario write-ups and all of that, and having people go, wow, that was a great experience, wow, this is interesting data, wow, that is provocative scenarios, that's a great well-written report, fantastic, I love it, and watch them put it on the bookshelf. Not what my intended result. And what I realized was, even though I talk about the fifth kind of key activity of futures thinking is activating change and change management and, being the change we want to create in the world, I didn't really have a whole lot of skills in that. Hence, partnering with my co-founder at Jigsaw Foresight, Victoria Ward, who is a change management, organizational change, team, storyteller expert. And so what we spend a lot of time doing now is exactly that. You take people through the fun, provocative, visionary, systemic, etc., future stuff. And then, as Victoria often says, Wendy brings the fun, I bring the pain. Because change hurts, right? And wow, I win in that trade-off. But and the point is that you have to actually offer people some support in carrying through the changes you're asking them to make. And you're right, it isn't done often enough. We don't do it often enough. It's not something we actually emphasize enough when we're training people in future studies and foresight. Okay, so people are going to have to go into their office or wake up in the morning and walk out in their community and be different, act differently, draw on different resources, create new processes. It's hard. That's really hard, especially because everyone around them will be going, "What on earth are you doing?" Right? So they need to know how to build networks of support, and they need to know how to interconnect the changes they're making with the changes somebody else is making, maybe over in another community or in another discipline that connects with some of the stuff they're trying to do. That's hard work. So yeah, one of our ethic questions or rules of thumb is, support the hard work, support the work of change. It's not just about visioning. It's not just about, amazing work is being done in the futures community these days with all the work in design, speculative design and design prototyping and experiential futures and speculative fiction and all of that is amazing at getting at provoking thinking in new ways. We need the equivalent wave of things of saying, so you've had this experience with this artifact. Now what? Now what are you going to do? So, okay, we have about 45 minutes left. I don't see any other hands up. I have seen, thank you so much to everyone who's been letting the verbose of us, chat away. I hope you have enjoyed the conversation. The chat line is fantastic. I wish I had more sets of eyes and a multi-partite brain that I could have watched everything at once. We've got ideas on the board. And again, this is rough categorization. It may not be exactly right in integral futures terms, but it was just a way to get some of the ideas up. So I guess my question is, where do we want to go from here? Would some of the people who are writing while the rest of us were talking like to kind of highlight one of the things they posted and talk to us about it? Either as sort of, here's an example, or some of these seem almost to be potential rules of thumb. So be ready to relate. Acknowledge the future is a space to talk and be different. Thinking through responsibility and foresight impact. I'm throwing the process open and back to the group. What do you want to do with what's on the board? Do you want to spend some time, just give everyone like a few minutes to tour the board and look at what's there and either raise questions or maybe begin to cluster some of them? Does that sound like a good idea?
That sounds like a great idea.
Okay, so let's take about 5 minutes. So that's until 20 after whatever hour it is, wherever you are. And everyone take a chance to read through, and especially those of you whose ideas I was capturing on Post-its while you were talking, look at what I wrote, and if it's wrong, fix it, correct it, or add to it. So feel free to cluster things, even if it wasn't something you wrote. If you see something that you think relates to something else, move it over, however you want to do it. So let's just take about 5 minutes to read and cluster. And then I would like to have a bit of a conversation about the relationships and where some of the ethical kind of tension moments occur, and maybe some rules of thumb about that. And say. I'm stopping sharing so you can concentrate on your own Miro boards. apologies for coughing in your ear. Let's take about maybe 1 more minute to finish typing up last thoughts. And then I want to use the last 20 minutes or so to move over to the sort of systems map section and start sort of thinking about what are things that maybe, and we've already identified some of them in our kind of storytelling. What are some of the interrelationships where ethics, that problematize ethics, versus maybe some of the interrelations that enable us to be more ethical or to be more mindful or thoughtful. Wow, mindful. Trying not to descend into the recent meme.
Wendy, we have a raised hand from Mishka. Did we want to
Yes,
jump
please.
in?
Sorry, I was typing something and didn't notice. Mishka, yes.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have a quick question, or a little bit of a fear that I see in a lot of discussions around and online. There is a lot about missing point of views and unpopular opinions, unpopular viewpoints, hearing every bell and all that, which I can understand, but at the same time, there is an issue of falling into the paradox of what's the name in English? The paradox of tolerance, you know?
Yes, exactly. The paradox of tolerance.
Yeah. So I think it's something we should take into account when we are talking about hearing everything, hearing everybody, right? Every opinion is valid and all that. All right, because if so, for people that don't know, the paradox of tolerance is that if you have a fully tolerance policy, right, your system is tolerant towards every opinion and everything and every speech, then the intolerant speech will have a space there, and it will end up winning all the space, right? It will end up dominating that space. So in the end, if you are fully tolerant towards everything, intolerance will be the governant speech, right? That's the main idea.
Right, and right, and that is difficult and problematic. So one of the issues is, for example, every input is valid. Not every input is valid, but everyone's, wow, this is tricky, but the right for everyone to have input is valid. So what do I mean by that? I can't imagine bringing a group of people into, well, I would feel it was unethical for me as a facilitator to bring a group of people into a room and let's say several were climate denialists, or, well, let's just stick with climate denialists. We're climate denialists and started talking to me about, started saying, well, we don't actually need to worry about the future of climate change because that's just a hoax. Okay, so the difficulty with that is, and one thing where futures could help is you could say, okay, so that's one possible future. You're right, and the rest of us are wrong. You're right, and all of the scientific establishment is wrong. And climate change isn't happening. But what are the probabilities of that? And what if you are wrong? What is the risk of your being wrong? So let's have that conversation about the risk of your being wrong. If you're wrong and we have climate change and, the Thwaites Glacier melts and we get sea level rise over the course of several months of a meter, what's the cost of that? Versus what's the cost of trying to offset some of that, or at least create adaptive strategies to live with that? So part of what is useful about futures, unlike other civic spaces where the paradox of tolerance is problematic, is that we can say, we can engage with you in a conversation by creating a space for you to think about what you think is true and saying that's one alternative possibility. We're here to talk about multiple alternative possibilities, and some of the other alternative possibilities are much higher risk. So we should, if we're being responsible, have contingency plans for them. So that is kind of one way to handle that. The other issue is what makes all of futures work much less straightforward than a lot of the people that describe it when they're talking about business strategic foresight projects, where issues are often not as problematic as they are in community foresight projects, or the kinds of situations that Stephen was sharing with us, where it's not just it's not merely community planning, it's merely community plan. It is community planning with a backdrop, a context of a history of massive trauma. And so you expect a lot of conflict in the space. You expect people with very different views in the space. And the validity of, and we cannot question the validity of people's experience. So the question always in futures is negotiating the conversation. The difficulty is that you have to set down rules of respect somehow, because the conversation cannot be allowed to become personally hurtful to the people in the room. It is a difficult problem, and I don't have any easy solutions to it, but what I come back to is, as a futures researcher, if I'm truly saying that one of the reasons we're interested in images of the future and in creating images working with groups of people to help them create images of the future is because images of the future affect behavior and and help you reperceive what your own personal possibilities are, as well as the possibilities of your team or group or tribe or community. If we really believe that is true, then one of the things we must also believe as researchers is that it's important to know what the images of the future are that are already in people's minds, even if those are very dark. And so getting them out and articulating them and sort of saying, well, this is what my view of the future is, even if it's horrible. And quite frankly, we're seeing that in the US presidential campaigning, right? Everything JD Vance and Trump says is sort of America as a hellscape. Oh my God, why are you articulating this view of the future? And yet they are. Do I disagree with it? Do I think it is not founded on actual data? Yes, those things are true, but you have to know that that image is out there and that there are people responding to it before we can start countering it. And I probably am just, I should be quiet now. It is a big problem and we have to wrestle with it. There's kind of no easier answer than that. Sorry. Anyone else have a brilliant idea or solution to this issue, the paradox of tolerance? Yes, anyone?
No
Caressa.
brilliant solution, but
Oh, dang.
as disappointing again. But as you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind is this idea that defining the terms is really important when it comes to holding a conversation like that with people who have views that may not hold the same values as views of the other people in the conversation. And some US-centric examples that come to mind are abortion. You have your pro-lifers and your pro-choicers, or the idea of critical race theory, which meant something completely different than the meaning it means in the zeitgeist right now. And when a group is able to redefine a term that is being used in a conversation, they completely change the conversation, completely change the focus of it. And it's very, very difficult to be able to talk about the things that are central to that conversation and the things that you want to achieve. So perhaps one thing we could be aware of if we're dealing with groups like that is any situations where the terms have been, the definitions aren't agreed upon, just so that we're not talking past each other.
Right. Sorry. And yes, there are more than two sides, but humans do kind of like thinking in yin yang terms. It's a probably bad default thinking habit. Good point, Lena. Lena, yes.
Very quickly, and I might miss my point. Oh my goodness, ADHD. What was I gonna say? It'll come back. So sorry, it's gone.
No worries. And I recently have come to appreciate just how very ADHD I am myself, so I can relate. Let's go back to this for a second, because I think some of the things we're talking about and things like duality, because there are multiple tribes, there are multiple points of view, and tribes aren't just community, tribes are also organizational and everything else. One of the things I was thinking about as I started kind of, and again, this is very personal, so add to it, I'm missing a lot. This was just an initial seed kernel of a systems, a soft systems map to kind of get the idea started. But what constrains? So, for example, the economy, it feels to me, is a, you know, is a is often what is constraining our being ethically tough or critically tough. Um, in criticizing the long history of scenario planning, by which people usually refer to 2x2 axes of uncertainty scenario building, Richard Slaughter famously said, well, the problem with them is they're all flatland scenarios, by which he meant these are all scenarios that take as given global capitalism, and you're trying to make profit for the shareholders. So they will always lack a specific critical component. And it's one of the, one of the first ethical issues that you sort of face if you're raised in or trained in a more critical futures tradition. And you go out to be a consultant, and big corporations say, yes, help us come up with strategic scenarios so we can double test our market strategy for the next 2 years or 5 years, and see how much more money we can make for the stockholders. And so coming up with a scenario, at least one scenario that goes, what if that all falls apart? What if you become a pariah because you are, in fact, found to be greenwashing, and you can't, it's very hard working with corporate clients to have conversations like that. So the economy can be a big constraint. Sometimes, what's interesting is sometimes our community and our tribe can be a constraint on some kinds of values, but a supporter of other kinds of values. So, what else either supports the sort of ethical stances we want to take or gets in the way? Are there other aspects? What are other components in our environment? And I've put some very big things here, like nature. Obviously, there can be much more specific items. Alexandra, and hi, Alexandra. Wow, long time no see.
Hey, Dr. Wendy. Thanks so much for holding this. I'm sorry I've been so quiet, but I'm on my phone, so I can barely see this mural. I definitely can't add. But I just wanted to say, I'm in a corporate environment now, have been for a couple of years, and I have found that the corporation, if they have this strong backbone of community, obligations and values, or at least, there's a lot of programming towards it, that really seems to help, because you can always use that as, okay, well, why should we care? Why should we do this? Well, because our company believes so much in, social justice. Remember, the founder gave all this money, they donate, so there's a different way of approaching it if you kind of use their own words against them, I guess, to some extent. And I'm talking about the company that I work within, so we work with external clients. So I'm talking about our own company. When someone says, well, we don't want to talk to, a corporate client about that. Well, but we should, because it reflects our values.
Right. So I've put strong community mission in the organization
Yeah.
down as a support item, kind of hooking into
Absolutely.
organizations and client, well, from my perspective, client teams, but the organizational team. Maybe I'll hook it into my team as well.
Perfect.
What else? What else are we forgetting that can either support us or
Can I just jump in? I'm sorry, I can't. I'm just being slow again. I'm trying to raise my hand. Can I?
just jump in, jump in. Yes,
I just
sometimes
think
it's hard to find those hand things.
it's Friday. I just think there's something about the time and space to do work with communities who come with a very different level of education, and I don't know quite where that fits in there, but that kind of plurality of I think it was something about, we can't question the validity of people's experiences, but actually that is a feature of a lot of this, that is how, we question the evidence that people bring. We question whether it's across different institutions. Do we value particular types of science more than others, like clinical evidence versus kind of social science evidence? There's power plays around that, kind of what institutions say and what communities say, and I think it is related to the economy and the capitalist thing that who gets to determine and fund what a project is then gets to determine the speed at which it goes and whether it's episodic and whether it, all of that stuff. So I think that was just a bit that might have a nuance that is worth kind of putting in that pink map.
Okay, I love that. So I've kind of summed it up in short as who decides, because it's not just the people who are controlling the economic clout, right? The people who are leaders for businesses who can give you a contract or not give you a contract, who can tell their internal teams to do one thing or another, who set the mission. It's also, and I think this is the point about different points of view and the colonization of other cultural epistemologies by Western science. It's also people like, the head of the American Medical Association or the British Medical Association or whatever the medical association is in your country, or the people who are at the forefront of certain academic disciplines and are saying and are supporting, because it's not usually as subtle, as overt as a directive. It's often as subtle as the graduate students you are giving funding to, the graduate students you aren't giving funding to because you actually think their topic possibly is not as important. So the gatekeepers, there are gatekeepers at a lot of different points of view. At a lot of different points in the overall system that kind of shove different points of view off the stage or delegitimize them. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think it's the whole load of things that come out of that, and and that it is about ultimately it's about legitimacy and voice and and how that shapes the work that we do.
Yeah. Actually, I'll put that up here. What else? If I'm at that moment that I think of as a facilitator of the popcorn is not popping as rapidly. And I know there are still some unpopped kernels down there on the warm pan of thought. But we are also about 15 minutes from closing. So What I will do, because some of you are traveling, some of you are can't kind of really engage with the Miro board while you've also got Zoom on. Totally respect that. I said I would lock things down. I will lock things down in about, I don't know, maybe tomorrow morning. I'll lock things down to give everyone time to get back to some place where they can look at this and maybe add a few last thoughts. And again, or make adjustments, say in the system Mac. And again, once I lock it down, you'll still be able to add in more post-its and add in comments. It's just that you won't be able to change what's already on the board. So that's one practical step forward. The ending thing, and up here where it says free form, this is like any stray thoughts you have, and they can be stray thoughts on anything we've discussed today. They can be stray thoughts on the fact that we have had this conversation. And again, thank you, Journal of Future Studies Community of Practice. Thank you, Noor Anissa, for hosting it. Thank you for giving us the space to have this conversation. So you can put whatever you like in free form. I love this. I hated this. Should have done more of this. Should have done more of the other. That's kind of for feedback. It's for thoughts that come kind of late at night. I don't know about you, but I always do this thing where like 6 hours later, I go, wow, here's what I really should have said. So, space for that. What, if anything, do we want to do with all of these thoughts and ideas and quandaries with which we've been wrestling going forward? What should come out of this? What do you want to do next as a community of practice?
Wendy?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Sabrina. Hi, everybody.
Sabrina, hi.
I think what comes up for me is to broaden the conversation, and to keep it going so that more, more perspectives, more ethics, more of that. Because I think when, as futurists, and when we talk about futures, that's a key piece. It's a key piece that we keep coming back to in terms of our work, in terms of futures and futuring. And it seems to be the piece that gets left out of planning and strategy, all across different types of organizations and governance and countries and bodies and the like. And so, because I think that there is definitely so many, as we even see on the Miro board now, so many different perspectives, but just how many more are there? And so I guess in our respective channels to generate even a broader conversation would be the next logical step, I suppose.
Okay. Anyone else? Thoughts?
Dr. Wendy?
Yeah.
I don't know what should come of this, but since there's silence, I would like to put in a shameless plug. Can you please do another systems course, because you taught my systems classes at University of Houston, and I love them. So I would like to know if you could do more systems courses, I guess as a refresher, so for my dissertation, and also just so I can be a better facilitator. So again, a shameless plug, and I would like to know if you could do that.
Well, okay, so quick. So everybody else, we're having a sidebar conversation at the moment. So here's the thing. If you mean like accredited, university accredited systems course, well, I'd need to have a university. If you meant, let's do a couple of community thinking sessions on how to use systems thinking, happy to do that, either in the context of um, Noor's schedule of JFS community of practice, or we could simply, create a standalone sidebar version. I frequently do systems thinking kind of one-offs for the next generation future practitioners. No, that's wrong. For the APF emerging fellows. So yeah, that's a possibility. Maybe we can ask APF or APF and JFS community of practice to sort of co-support doing a series of those. Anyway, we can explore that. So that's another thing. But back to
Awesome.
ethics. Okay, nag me on it on LinkedIn. And we'll see what we can get organized. What else do we want to do with this, with what we've got here? With regard to whoever put first start a collection of good practice, or do we have enough of them? Well, I think we do have enough of them. And you may have noticed that I was putting hashtag R or hashtag rule next to some things. So one of the things that I can imagine doing is going through this and just kind of collecting an initial list. So organizing it a little bit further. Just again, rules of thumb. Sorry, sinuses. Rules of thumb. Nothing hard and fast, but just here's some ideas that you might want to consider as you're engaging in futures practice. So, and what else do we want to do? Elaine.
Hi, sorry, this is a bit off subject, but connected. Because I've done work with UN migration, and they're very, very cognizant of the fact of, although they're embedding forward-looking approaches and strategic foresight and exploring using scenarios further, particularly around labour economics with member states. But one of the the big red flags are the ethical considerations, and which kind of encapsulates the discussion we've had today of member states using future scenarios conversely instead of for good in terms of migration. And so I think there's some very contextual situations, particularly as the UN and UN Global Pulse and this kind of pushing of foresight across UN and member state. And there's that you don't know what you don't know danger, which setting all sorts of hairs running and not ethical practice in many spaces. So, this is not just running at HQ level, but regional and country offices. And there are some threads that could be horrific without, and this concept of ethical practice fully embedded into the training. Anyway, just a thought.
That's interesting. And the sort of after the Summit of the Future, when much of the UN at the top level at least is talking about futures practice and trying to support embedding futures practice, that issue of whether or not they are thinking through the ethical considerations of doing that, I think that's a really important issue. Okay, so should UN futures work include ethical oversight? Not that I would ever champion adding a layer of bureaucracy to what is already a horrendously bureaucratic institution, but that is an interesting question. What else? We have 6 minutes. Last call for thoughts. Okay, great. Thread on the JFS community LinkedIn page to keep this going. All right, and to kick that off, not immediately, because I have several overdue things to write. but I could post a summary of some rules of thumb just to sort of provoke people to add more thoughts on the LinkedIn page. And also a link to the Miro board. Actually, that might be even easier. Yes, we